12th April. On this day in 1980, the Americo-Liberian government was violently deposed by a group of non-commissioned soldiers led by Master Sergeant Samuel Kenyon Doe in the country's capital city of Monrovia. It was and remained the only time in the history of African politics that non-commissioned soldiers were taking over the governance of a nation at the expense of commissioned officers. In the coup, President William Tolbert was murdered. The coup was staged by an indigenous Liberian faction of the Armed Forces of Liberia, AFL, under the command of Doe. In the early hours of that day, 17 non-commissioned officers, NCOs, and soldiers of the AFL, led by Doe, launched the ultimately violent uprising. All of the conspirators were indigenous Liberians, while Tolbert belonged to Americo-Liberians. The group entered the executive mansion of the presidential palace and killed Tolbert, whose body was dumped into a mass grave together with 27 other victims of the coup. It is reported that Harrison Penno was the person that killed Tolbert. Later, a crowd of angry Liberians gathered to shout insults and throw rocks at the bodies. By the end of April, most of the cabinet members of the Tolbert administration had been put on trial in a kangaroo court and sentenced to death. 13 of them were publicly executed by firing squad on 22nd April at a beach near the Barclay Training Center in Monrovia. The executed were Frank E. Tolbert, brother of President Tolbert and President pro tempore of the Senate; Richard A. Henrys, Speaker of the House of Representatives; E. Reginald Townsend, National Chairman of the True Whig Party; P. Clarence Parker II, Chairman of the National Investment Council and Treasurer of the True Whig Party; James A. Pierre, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court; Joseph J. Chasson Sr., Minister of Justice; Cecil Dennis, Minister of Foreign Affairs; Cyril Bright, former Minister of Planning and Economic Affairs; John W. Sherman, Assistant Minister of Commerce and Trade; James T. Phillips, former Minister of Finance, former Minister of Agriculture; David Franklin Neal, former Minister of Planning and Economic Affairs; Charles T. O. King, Deputy Minister for Agriculture; Frank J. Stewart Sr., Director of the Budget. The executions were described by Larry C. Price as a nightmarish scenario in which the executed men were murdered in front of screaming crowds of jubilant indigenous Liberian citizens. Cecil Dennis was the last man to be shot and was reported to have defiantly stared his killers down whilst uttering a prayer before his execution. Only 4 members of the Tolbert administration survived the coup in its aftermath. Among them was the Minister of Finance and future President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the Vice President Benny D. Warner, and Agricultural Minister Florence Chenoweth. Chenoweth was able to escape to neighboring Sierra Leone before making her way to the United States while Warner was out of the country at the time of the coup. Warner unsuccessfully tried setting up a government in exile before Doe offered him clemency and permission to return to Liberia in 1984. Sirleaf was initially detained but subsequently offered a position in Doe's government, which she initially accepted, but later fled the country for the U.S. after she publicly criticized Doe's policies. Both Sirleaf and Chenoweth later returned to Liberian politics after Doe's death. Following the coup, Doe assumed the rank of general and established the People's Redemption Council, PRC, composed of himself and 14 other low-ranking officers, to rule the country. The PRC was dissolved after the 1985 general election, in which Doe was elected president. He was sworn in on 6 February 1986. Doe continued to rule the country until he was murdered on September 9, 1990 by the MPFC, led by Prince Johnson, during the First Liberian Civil War.
History Desk TV. Explore the past, analyzing the future.
April 12th. On this day in 1945, President of the United States of America, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, died of ailment in office, and Vice President Harry S. Truman became president. Roosevelt died toward the last days of World War II. When Roosevelt returned to the United States from the Yalta Conference, many were shocked to see how old, thin and frail he looked. He spoke while seated in the well of the House, an unprecedented concession to his physical incapacity. During March 1945, he sent strongly worded messages to Russian Premier Joseph Stalin, accusing him of breaking his Yalta commitments over Poland, Germany, prisoners of war, and other issues relating to World War II. When Stalin accused the Western Allies of plotting behind his back a separate peace with Hitler, Roosevelt replied, "I cannot avoid a feeling of bitter resentment towards your informers, whoever they are, for such vile misrepresentations of my actions or those of my trusted subordinates." On March the 29th, 1945, Roosevelt went to the Little White House at Warm Springs, Georgia, to rest before his anticipated appearance at the founding conference of the United Nations. In the afternoon of April the 12th, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, while sitting for a portrait, Roosevelt said, "I have a terrific headache." He then slumped forward in his chair, unconscious, and was carried into his bedroom. The president's attending cardiologist, Dr. Howard Bruen, diagnosed the medical emergency as a massive intracerebral hemorrhage. At 3:35 p.m. that day, Roosevelt died at the age of 63. On the morning of April 13th, Roosevelt's body was placed in a flag-draped coffin and loaded onto the presidential train for the trip back to Washington. Along the route, thousands flocked to the tracks to pay their respects. After a White House funeral on April 14th, Roosevelt was transported by train from Washington, D.C. to his place of birth at Hyde Park. As was his wish, Roosevelt was buried on April 15th in the Rose Garden of his Springwood estate. Roosevelt's declining physical health had been kept secret from the general public. His death was met with shock and grief across the U.S. and around the world. After Germany surrendered the following month, newly sworn-in President Truman dedicated Victory in Europe Day and its celebrations to Roosevelt's memory, and kept the flags across the U.S. at half-staff for the remainder of the 30-day mourning period, saying that his only wish was that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to witness this day. World War II finally ended with the signed surrender of Japan in September, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the very late Soviet entry into the war against the Japanese. Truman presided over the demobilization of the war effort and the establishment of the United Nations and other post-war institutions envisioned during Roosevelt's presidency.
History Desk TV. Explore the past, analyzing the future.